The hypersonic phase just started, and NATO has no answer for it. Not a test, not a simulation, not a laboratory demonstration designed for a defense ministry press release. Iran just fired a hypersonic missile that punched through the most sophisticated air defense architecture the Western alliance has ever assembled, and the silence coming out of Brussels right now is not strategic composure, it is institutional shock. It is the sound of 75 years of NATO deterrence doctrine being rewritten in real time by a nation that wasn't supposed to have this capability for another decade. Here is the number that matters, Mach 15. That is the terminal velocity of Iran's Fateh 2 hypersonic glide vehicle. Mach 15 means the missile is covering 1 mile every 0.4 seconds in its terminal phase. The Patriot PAC-3 system, NATO's primary theater missile defense backbone, the $1 billion battery that every alliance member points to when asked about hypersonic threats, has a reaction window of approximately 4 to 9 seconds against a ballistic trajectory. Against a maneuvering hypersonic glide vehicle at Mach 15, that reaction window doesn't shrink, it disappears. Completely. Mathematically. Physically. Gone. This is not a military equipment story. This is a story about the $1.3 trillion that NATO members have collectively spent on defense infrastructure built around assumptions that just became obsolete overnight. About an alliance whose entire eastern flank, from Tallinn to Warsaw to Bucharest, is now covered by air defense systems that cannot intercept the missile Iran just demonstrated it owns. About the hidden financial earthquake that happens when the most expensive military alliance in human history discovers that its core defensive premise no longer holds. The deterrence gap just opened, and every adversary on Earth is measuring it right now. Let's be precise about what the Fateh 2 actually is, because precision matters when the technology is this consequential. The Fateh 2 is Iran's second-generation hypersonic glide vehicle, publicly unveiled in 2023 and now demonstrably operational. It is launched on a ballistic trajectory by a solid fuel booster, meaning no liquid fuel preparation time, no launch signature detectable hours in advance, no logistical footprint that intelligence satellites can track and warn against. The glide vehicle separates from the booster at high altitude, and then maneuvers, this is the critical word, maneuvers, through the upper atmosphere, at hypersonic speeds toward its target. Traditional ballistic missiles follow a predictable parabolic arc. Every air defense system ever built, Patriot, THAAD, Arrow 3, S-400, is fundamentally designed around intercepting objects that follow predictable arcs. You track the trajectory, you calculate the intercept point, you fire your interceptor to meet the incoming weapon at a predetermined location in space. The entire mathematical framework of missile defense is built on this single assumption, that the incoming weapon will be where physics says it will be. Hypersonic glide vehicles destroy that assumption completely. The Fateh 2 doesn't follow a predictable arc, it maneuvers laterally, it changes altitude, it adjusts its flight path in the terminal phase based on evasion algorithms specifically designed to defeat intercept geometry, and it does all of this at Mach 15. By the time a Patriot battery's radar detects, tracks, calculates, and fires, the target has already moved. Not slightly, significantly. The interceptor arrives at a location the threat has already vacated. Now apply that reality to NATO's eastern flank. Poland has 2 Patriot batteries. Romania has 1. The Baltic states have point defense systems that couldn't intercept a subsonic cruise missile under saturation conditions, let alone a maneuvering hypersonic vehicle. Germany, the industrial heart of European NATO, the economy that underwrites the alliance's financial credibility, has exactly 4 Patriot batteries covering a country of 84 million people and 137,000 square miles of critical infrastructure. 4 batteries. Against a weapon that those batteries demonstrably cannot intercept. The financial implication of this vulnerability is massive, and it is immediate. European defense stocks surged after Russia's 2022 invasion. Rheinmetall, BAE Systems, Leonardo, Thales, the entire European defense industrial complex received a financial re-rating based on one core assumption, that the threat was known, that the response was purchasable, and that sufficient defense spending over a sufficient time frame could restore the security architecture that decades of post-Cold War complacency had eroded. NATO members committed to 2% GDP defense spending targets. Germany announced its historic €100 billion Bundeswehr modernization fund. Poland accelerated to 4% GDP defense spending, the highest in the alliance. All of that spending, all of that financial commitment, all of those political fights over defense budgets in parliaments from London to Ljubljana. And Iran just demonstrated that the foundational technology assumption underneath all of it, that Patriot-class systems provide meaningful hypersonic defense, is wrong. The spending didn't buy the security, it bought the illusion of security. And there is a catastrophic financial difference between those two things. To understand the full depth of what just happened, you need to understand how military technology transitions have historically destroyed empires that couldn't adapt fast enough. Because this pattern, a dominant power's defensive architecture becoming obsolete faster than its financial capacity can replace it, is not new. It is one of the oldest and most reliable patterns in the entire history of power transitions. Study 1340. The Battle of Sluisen. England's Edward III faces the French fleet, the dominant naval power of the era, numerically superior, financially better resourced, representing the established military order of medieval Europe. English longbowmen firing from elevated positions on their ships devastate the French fleet before it can close to boarding range. The technological advantage of the longbow range, rate of fire, penetrating power, renders the French military investment in heavily armored knights and close-quarters naval tactics not just ineffective but actively counterproductive. France had spent decades and enormous treasury resources building a military architecture that became obsolete in a single afternoon. The financial consequence was not just the battle loss. It was the 116 years of strategic overextension that followed the 100 Years' War, as France attempted to restore by financial attrition what it had lost through technological surprise. The treasury hemorrhage of maintaining that conflict contributed directly to the social and financial instability that would eventually produce the conditions for French institutional collapse 2 centuries later. Now map that pattern onto NATO in 2025. The alliance has spent approximately $1.3 trillion collectively on defense in the past 3 years alone. The United States contributes roughly $886 billion annually. European members are collectively adding $380 billion per year, and rising. These are not small numbers. These are civilization-scale financial commitments made on the basis of a specific threat assessment that the primary challenge was Russian conventional military power, Iranian ballistic missiles on predictable trajectories, and Chinese economic competition that would play out over decades. The FATA-2 just invalidated a critical component of that threat assessment. And here is the financial nuclear weapon hidden inside that invalidation. Replacing Patriot-class systems with genuine hypersonic defense capability, the terminal high-altitude area defense upgrades, the next-generation interceptor programs, the directed energy systems, that represent the only realistic long-term answer to maneuvering hypersonic threats, carries an estimated price tag of $300 to $500 billion across the NATO alliance over the next decade. That is new spending, on top of existing commitments, by governments that are already carrying sovereign debt loads, that would have been considered catastrophic by any pre-2008 financial standard. Germany's debt-to-GDP ratio sits at 66%. France is at 112%. Italy is at 137%. These are not countries with vast financial reserves available to absorb a $300 billion surprise defense recapitalization. These are countries running structural deficits, facing demographic contraction, managing energy transition costs, and simultaneously trying to maintain the social welfare architectures that provide their governments with domestic political legitimacy. The money for a genuine hypersonic defense response does not exist inside the current fiscal architecture of European NATO. It would have to be borrowed, at interest rates that are no longer near zero, from bond markets that are already pricing European sovereign debt with increasing skepticism. This is the hidden financial force that the FATA-2 just unleashed. Not the missile itself, the fiscal impossibility of the adequate response to the missile. Iran spent approximately $50 to $100 million developing the FATA-2 program over its development lifecycle. The cost to NATO of adequately responding to that capability is conservatively 3,000 times larger. That is not asymmetric warfare. That is financial judo at a civilizational scale, using the weight of the defender's own spending commitments against them. The Ottoman Empire understood this dynamic from the receiving end in the 19th century. The Tanzimat reforms, the desperate modernization program launched after Ottoman military technology fell catastrophically behind European standards, required financial resources the empire simply did not possess. The response was borrowing. European banks, primarily French and British, provided the capital. By 1881, the Ottoman public debt had grown so large that the empire was forced to accept a public debt administration, effectively foreign financial control of Ottoman fiscal policy, as the price of continued access to European credit markets. The military modernization that was supposed to save the empire instead became the financial mechanism of its subjugation. The empire borrowed to survive the technology gap, and the borrowing killed it slower but more completely than any battlefield defeat could have. NATO's member governments are not facing Ottoman-scale collapse, but they are facing a version of the same impossible arithmetic. The technology gap requires spending that the fiscal position cannot support without borrowing. The borrowing increases debt service costs that crowd out other spending, including defense. The defense spending shortfall perpetuates the technology gap. The cycle tightens with each iteration, and Iran with a $50 million missile program is the entity that just set that cycle in motion. Watch 3 things in the next 30 days that will tell you exactly how serious NATO's leadership believes this capability gap actually is. First, watch the emergency session calendar at NATO headquarters in Brussels. A convened extraordinary ministerial meeting within 2 weeks signals that the alliance's military committee has assessed the FATA-2 demonstration as a genuine Tier 1 threat requiring immediate, collective response. No emergency session means the public posture is managed minimization, which itself tells you everything about the gap between what NATO knows and what NATO is willing to say publicly. Second, watch the European defense budget supplemental announcements. If Germany, Poland, or France announces emergency defense supplemental spending, specifically referencing hypersonic defense capability within 60 days, the fiscal earthquake has already begun inside the finance ministries. These announcements will be framed in technical language about modernization and capability enhancement. Read through the language. What they will actually be announcing is that the $1.3 trillion spent over the past 3 years bought the wrong thing, and the bill for buying the right thing is coming due simultaneously. Third, and this is the signal that matters most financially, watch the credit default swap spreads on European sovereign debt, not the headlines, the CDS market, because institutional bond investors price geopolitical risk into sovereign credit before any public acknowledgement of that risk appears in official statements. A widening of French or Italian CDS spreads in the weeks following this demonstration, against a backdrop of flat or tightening US spreads, tells you that the smart money has already done the math on European fiscal capacity versus European defense requirements and found the arithmetic wanting. Here is the final truth that every financial cycle, every empire transition, every technology shock in recorded history eventually arrives at. Deterrence is not a military condition, it is a financial condition. It exists as long as the cost of challenging the dominant power exceeds the challenger's capacity to pay that cost. The moment the mathematics inverts, the moment the cost of maintaining deterrence exceeds the defender's fiscal capacity while the cost of challenging it falls within the challenger's reach, the deterrence is already gone. The missiles and the soldiers and the aircraft carriers are just the physical expression of a financial reality that was determined long before the first weapon was fired. Iran did not just shock NATO command with a hypersonic missile tonight. Iran demonstrated that it has found the precise point where the financial mathematics of Western deterrence inverts, where a $50 million development program forces a $500 billion response that the responding economies cannot afford without compromising the fiscal stability that underwrites their political legitimacy and their credit ratings and their ability to borrow for the next response after that. Every great power that has ever faced this inversion has told itself the same story, that the technology gap is temporary, that sufficient resolve and sufficient spending will restore the equation, that the challenger has overreached and will be contained. Rome told itself this story about the Hunnic cavalry. Britain told itself this story about German naval rearmament in 1935. The story is always told with complete sincerity, and it is always wrong for the same reason, because the inversion, once it happens, does not reverse, it deepens. The defender spends more to close a gap that keeps moving. The challenger spends less to keep the gap open, and the compound interest of that asymmetry, paid out across years and decades, is what empires are actually built and destroyed by. The hypersonic phase just started. NATO is already behind. And the bill for catching up is a number that Europe's finance ministers are going to spend the next decade pretending they can pay. The pattern always repeats. The only question is whether you see it in time.